Welcome, everybody, to the fourth installment of In Search of Civility. I'm Matt Erpelding, Vice President of Government and Community Relations at the Boise Metro Chamber, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with my co-moderator, Kelly Packer, who will be on in just a second. But before we introduce our guests, just a bit of background on In Search of Civility. The series is an innovative partnership between the Association of Idaho Cities, Smith and Malek Attorneys, and the Boise Metro Chamber. And this year, we've committed to discussing the challenges presented to our state and country as we become increasingly polarized and unable to work through issues in a collaborative manner. But before we get to the larger scale discussion today, we could not provide high quality content without the support of our presenting sponsors. Dawson Taylor Coffee and Idaho Central Credit Union have committed to this series for the entire year, and we're gracious for their support. Additionally, our sponsors Power Engineers and Earthstead Architects have been with us from the beginning. These sponsors are the folks who make quality content happen, and without them, we couldn't do this. Finally, I'd like to thank our media partners. Our media partners are the folks who provide us with a platform and with an audience to spread the message of the idea of civility, collaboration, and working together to find common solutions to common problems. Today, our media partners are Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, and the Idaho Press. Without them, we wouldn't have as easy a time distributing this conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to add my co-moderator, Kelly Packer, to the conversation. Representative Packer, former Representative Packer, it's great to see you. I wanted to start with, before we get to our guests, you and I both have a long history with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. We were part of the first state training that was brought to Idaho by the speaker and the pro tem at the time. And it really opened our eyes. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about your experience with the National Institute and NextGen.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to co-host with you, as well as to highlight such an amazing organization as the National Institute for Civil Discourse and NextGen. They, as you mentioned, came to Idaho, I believe, in 2015. We were seeing some disheartening, disturbing environments in the Idaho legislature. We had recently had the primaries closed, and we saw a distancing, for lack of a better term, of ideas and collaboration and relationship building and working together. And it was really a sad time for me. We had just had, in my opinion, 2 years of phenomenal legislative session, legislative opportunity, with a big class coming in, yours and my class coming in. And we had an environment at that point where everyone seemed to be willing to work together. It didn't mean that we always agreed, right? But we worked together, and we were kind to each other, and we had no problem having conversations, and we could disagree during the day and actually have amazing social events in the evening where we furthered discussions and further built relationships. And it was really wonderful. But then the primaries were closed. We had a distancing in ideology, as I think, in my opinion, the two parties more polarized ends came into the legislature. I'm trying to be as kind as I can here. And some of that collaboration and cooperation stopped. And so the speaker, Speaker Bedke, and the pro tem at the time, Brent Hill, brought in NICD to help us with our first civility training. And I was so impressed with what we received there and the opportunities to learn and grow and become a better person, as well as a better legislator. And then from there, I've had the opportunity to also train with them as a facilitator and do some of those same events in other legislatures. And I'm now the co-chair, national co-chair for that organization, for NextGen. So with that.
Well, and Idaho has a really rich history with the National Institute for Civil Discourse, because we've had another national co-chair in Senator Winthrop, who was a national co-chair.
Yes.
Senator Hill, who we're about to introduce, is now the program coordinator for NextGen. But, you know, the interesting thing about this challenge was that on both sides, as those primaries got closed, we saw a substantial increase in that polarization or that ideology that came into the legislature. And this was one of the first steps to do that. Later on, I had the opportunity to travel with the pro tem and the speaker to Massachusetts for a state legislative leaders foundation program through the National Institute. And what I thought was interesting there is that in Idaho, a lot of the fight and a lot of that incivility was partly the result of the distribution of the legislature. And so It's been a really interesting experience. So before we get to the questions, let's introduce our guests, and we'll start with Senator Hill, former Senator Hill.
Wonderful. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Pro Tem Brent Hill. He will always be pro tem to me, so I hope he doesn't mind. But Brent Hill is the program director for the NextGen program, Next Generation program of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. He works directly with various state legislatures throughout the country to promote civil discourse and create a culture where engaging differences constructively leads to better public policy development. He served in the Idaho State Senate for 19 years. He was the highest ranking member of the Idaho State Senate for 10 years, making him the longest serving president pro tempore in Idaho's history. He did not seek re-election in 2020. He is a retired certified public accountant and certified financial planner with over 35 years of business and financial experience. Born and raised in Idaho, he earned his accounting degree from Utah State University. Most importantly, Brent and his wife Julie have raised 4 sons who in turn have blessed them with 21 grandchildren. Welcome, Pro Tem Hill.
Thanks, Kelly. Nice to see you, you and Matt, even though it's on the screen. It's still nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
And next, we would like to welcome Denise Driehaus. She's born and raised on the west side of Cincinnati, and she's a lifelong resident of Hamilton County and current resident of Fairview Heights. She's honored to serve her hometown as president of the Hamilton County Board of Commissioners. Prior to serving as a county commissioner, she served 4 terms in the Ohio legislature as the representative of the 31st Ohio House District. As the first woman to serve as the ranking member of the House Finance Committee, she collaborated with other representatives and community leaders to secure state funding for infrastructure and economic development projects throughout Hamilton County. And as a county commissioner, she's worked to promote inclusion in Hamilton County, fight the opioid epidemic, ensure the safety and health of children and seniors in her community, and invest public dollars in a strategic way to grow neighborhoods and business districts. Before entering full-time public service, Denise owned and managed 2 small businesses, and she has 2 wonderful kids, Sarah and Andrew. Welcome, Commissioner. We're really glad to have you.
Yeah, no grandkids though, man. I feel like I've lost this competition right now.
That's the one thing that's on your side. So before we get started to talk about some of the questions we have with regard to civility, just a quick check-in, and we'll start with you, Commissioner. How's it going with COVID? How's your county doing? And do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
I definitely see light at the end of the tunnel. We've got enough vaccine right now to vaccinate people without even having registration, right? They just walk up, they get vaccinated. And so we're moving into hard to reach communities to make sure that that happens. So we're about 40% or so. Our target is 80, which is really aggressive. But we hope to get there. And I personally have gotten my second shot. So I'm feeling pretty good about things.
Great. Senator Hill.
Yes. Well, I'm already seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. My wife and I have both been vaccinated, and it's opened up a whole new freedom for us, to tell you the truth. We're still careful, and we still follow the protocols, but we can spend time with our grandchildren, which is really important to us, and without having to worry about spreading something to them, again, with the necessary precautions and so forth. And so we are excited. We feel much more comfortable than we did before that vaccination came out. I just encourage everyone to take advantage of that wonderful thing.
Well, and we're not going to go down the vaccination conversation too much today, but you want to talk about an issue that has led to some incivility. It's a pretty wild occurrence. I'm glad you both are vaccinated, and let's get to the conversation at hand.
Brent, if you don't mind, I'd like to kick it off with a question to you.
Okay.
You spearheaded several civility trainings in Idaho, and we talked a little bit about that at the beginning. And now you're the executive director at NextGen. Why is this what you've decided to do as your post-legislative career?
Well, thanks, Kelly. It wasn't part of our plan, as you probably know, but we decided after 19 years in the legislature, it was time not to seek re-election. Again, we thought we'd spend more time with our family, have some other plans. When I say we, my wife Julie and I. We were then contacted when I announced that we were not going to seek re-election. I was contacted by the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And of course, like you said, we had a relationship with them before. We were impressed with their program. We liked what it did for the Idaho legislature and so forth. And so I had some interest in it, and they asked me to head up this part of the program, which is going out to legislatures across the country and having these workshops and try to help bridge that polarization and that gap that we have, which leads to incivility. And I don't know, it just felt like taking some of the knowledge and the experiences that we had during that 19 years and put it to good use, rather than just experiencing complete retirement there. So it was just a nice fit. And we've had a number of programs already, even during this COVID world. We are doing them virtually. It's not quite as fun as getting together with everyone, but we're seeing some success, and we're still helping legislatures across the country, and so no regrets at this point.
Commissioner Driehaus, you are a facilitator for NextGen, and you've been involved in Ohio politics for a really long time. Give us a little bit of the lay of the land of Ohio politics and where it's at on the civility spectrum, and talk a little bit about why you decided to become a facilitator for NextGen.
Yeah, so this started in Ohio in 2013, and I was at the first class when it started. And so it was a great bipartisan group. The value of what the exercises we were doing became very obvious to all of us that were in the room when it came to better understanding one another, having constructive conversations about ourselves and about legislation and things that we believe deeply in, and then trying to figure out ways to work with one another with that common understanding. And so I remember sitting next to a guy, his name is Jerry Stebleton. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and we became fast friends, and we remained fast friends for years after that. So it does that to a person, right? That these kinds of exercises where you talk to people that you might not otherwise talk about, or talk to rather. So in Ohio, it's very challenging right now because the districts are so gerrymandered. And what has happened is the primaries then become the real elections. They're very safe districts. And so the primaries are the competitive piece of it. And so what happens in a primary is that oftentimes you get people that are kind of on, as Kelly was saying, not kind of the polar side of the spectrum. And when you get that happening in both the Democratic and the Republican primaries, then you've got a group of people in the legislature that sit kind of on the outsides of the polar opposites of their parties. So it's created an issue. There are not as many moderate folks in the legislature. And right now, the Republicans dominate all the branches, Senate, House, and every statewide office. So it's become a very challenging environment.
Oh, sorry, Kelly.
That's all right. That's okay. Denise, if it's all right, I'd like to stay with you for just a second. Can you tell me how you would define civility, and do you feel like it's necessary for good governance? Yeah, so civility and civil discourse is not just being polite to one another. It's not just being nice. It's about listening to one another and having respect for someone else's point of view, even though it might not be shared by yourself. And then trying to figure out a way to put things together with other people. It's about coming together in a real constructive way to work together. That's what civility and civil discourse means, because without it, you then have oftentimes just one point of view. And as we all know, good legislation and good conversations are when people with differing points of view come together and make something that we've got better, because people have a lot of different perspectives on what you're talking about.
Senator Hill, the commissioner brings up a really good point, and that is that as people become more ideologically rigid, it's much harder for them to see value in other ideas. The challenge with some of these civility conversations, and you and I've talked about this before, the challenge with some of these civility questions are, some people say that we use civility as a way to just silence the minority. And what do you say to that? How do you address that concern, which on multiple occasions through this program, people have brought up that these civility programs are really a tool for silencing the minority?
Well, I had never thought of it that way, but I have heard that criticism, the last few months as I've been working here with NICD. That's not what civility is all about. It should never be used to stifle a meaningful discussion, even about contentious issues. Never an excuse to silence other points of view. It's just the opposite. It should be a vehicle to explore ideas and other viewpoints and so forth. In our NextGen program, we have 7 key principles of civility. And let me just go through a couple of those for you. Engaging differences is the first one. That means to engage and talk about our differences and understand our differences. There's a huge satisfaction that comes when we successfully connect across divides. It's part of the best part of being human, I guess. And if we're going to achieve our common goal of being a more perfect union, we've got to discuss those differences and do it in a civil way. Another one of those principles is listening for understanding. I mean, that doesn't sound like silencing other ideas. That's just the opposite of it. Empathy, humility. These are characteristics that we need to learn if we want to have civil discussion. Cutting other people off, telling them they're not being civil, or using it as a way to silence others, that's, again, just the opposite of what civil discourse is. Civil discourse is more listening than talking. In fact, when I talk about this with some groups, I remind them that silent and listen have exactly the same letters in them, except that they're in a different order. You can't listen for understanding while you're being the one talking. You need to listen and try to understand things from another person's point of view. That's the essence of civility. And people are using the word civility to do something else. They're not showing civility at all, in my opinion.
Commissioner, recently the 4 hosts of this program, Diana Laciando, Luke Malik, Kelly, and myself, penned an op-ed that identified something you said in your opening comments, which is, as Idaho closed its primaries, it led to a little bit more of an ideological bend through the election process, which has created more rigidity, which then in turn we feel has created incivility, and that people aren't willing to hear other people's ideas. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in Ohio, and have you seen similar things? And I know you brought it up a little bit, but maybe you could expand on it.
Yeah, and I have seen similar things. I think it leads to attitudes that you're just too exhausted to listen to the other side. You're just not interested in listening to the other side when you believe, and you're an ideologue, and you believe that you are right and no one has anything of value to add. I mean, that is just not helpful in life, and it's certainly not helpful in lawmaking and working as a collective in a legislature, in our case, 99 members of the House. And so it is only when you recognize that people's differences aren't a negative thing, rather they're things to learn from, right? They're assets. The diversity is the asset, because you capture different ideas, and it's only when you're open to those ideas and open to that conversation that you can make progress. And so when you've got people so entrenched in opposite points of view that they just cannot manage to get together, that's when things start to really break down. And there are circumstances, obviously, where that happens, but others where people are still trying to work together. In Ohio, I was in a minority for 6 years and got many bills passed because I was able to reach across the aisle, treat people with respect, and then let them understand that while I may have a different point of view, there's some value in it, and I value their point of view. And so there is certainly a way to manage that, and that's what I think people are struggling with right now.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think the points that have been made so far, in fact, I learned that silent and listen have the same letters in them. I had never heard that before. I think that's amazing. And I think it's wonderful. And it's true. And when we seek to understand and seek to, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that we change our points of view or our direction, or even definitely not our value system, but it just might. We might have those aha moments where we learn something and we grow a little bit and we truly focus on the right solution for the day rather than being the right person, right? Or the right idea of the day. So with that, I'm going to ask you another question, Commissioner, and that is, has NextGen seen success in the trainings that they've done in various legislatures across the nation? And do you think it's even possible to have a positive impact on civility in today's political environment?
I do, because I think there are some very practical, both small and big things you can do. And so through NextGen, you think through and you hear others think through what are the barriers to civility, and what are the opportunities? You know, is it maybe the way people sit in a committee room? I served on a committee in the Ohio legislature where it wasn't Democrats and Republicans on either side of the room. We were all mixed up together. And so you're gonna reach out and say, hey, how was your weekend? Yeah, I mean, so you automatically get to know one another and start to create relationships. So something as simple as a seating chart can be a way to do this. I have another example where he was the Speaker of the House, who became a very good friend of mine, lives in a very different part of Ohio than I do. I'm in Cincinnati. It's very urban. It's very diverse. He lives in southeastern Ohio, and I went to visit his district. I was on a traveling committee. And the difference between his area and mine was so dramatic. And I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is why you're advocating for what you're advocating for and the way that you're doing it. And so it was really enlightening. And so we encourage through NextGen to do these small things, right? Do these exercises where you learn about one another, you create a relationship, and then you start to move into working together. And it becomes like a reflex almost once you've done some of those preliminary things.
Great. Pro Tem Hill, protests obviously have been a major focus recently, both from what's happened at the national level as well as here in Idaho. And so it's been a major focus of discussions. And I'm just wondering if feelings of unequal treatment, especially when you look at the Add the Words protests we've had here in Idaho for civil rights and the Bundy protests against mask mandates, how do you think political leaders should have handled these two situations? Do you think they should have been handled differently?
Well, first of all, I support people's right to demonstrate, particularly with their elected political people at the Capitol and other places. For years we had the LGBT community come and demonstrate. I encouraged that. They would, whether they were out on the front steps or inside the Capitol, I often stopped and visited with them and listened to what they had to say and thanked them for being part of the process and so forth. So the problem is every situation, just like we saw at the National Capitol, is a little different, and so you rely, the political leaders there, we rely a great deal on the Capitol security, on the Department of Administration, on the Idaho State Police, and others on how to handle each situation. It's not, we're busy trying to make policy, and so we don't have as much involvement in that as some people might think. However, I think one difference between the two, Mr. Bundy, as you know, he was arrested, he was in jail, so I'm not sure what the differences are that people saw. One thing that resulted in the problems with some in the LGBT community was not that they were demonstrating, not that they were spending time in the Capitol, or it only came to a head when they were blocking the entrance to the Idaho State Senate so that the legislators could not get in and do the people's business. And when we reached that point, then security had to take some action and so forth. But I don't have any criticism of the way any of those things were handled. In retrospect, just like with what went on with the Capitol, we can look back and say, well, we should have done this, we should have done that. But with the knowledge that the legislative leaders had, as well as with what the Idaho State Police had and so forth at the time, I think they tried to handle it as diplomatically and as carefully as they could, not trying to infringe on anybody's rights, but at the same time letting the legislature conduct their business.
There were a couple differences in those protests. One was the Ada County sheriffs parked a bus to arrest the Add the Words folks, and they trotted them all out and put them on the bus, whereas the Bundy group kind of violently overpowered state patrol members, broke a glass window in the House chambers, and then actually were allowed to kind of continue there. So there were some differences. In those differences, the way that, and the rise of this conversation was really defining how we define politics. And in politics, we've defined it as the authoritative allocation of resources. So that's the political side. But then on the policy making side, there's probably some importance that it's the actual mediation of values. And how do we mediate values to find common policy? With this ideological rigidness, we've come to this place where both sides are saying they're always wrong. And so it's kind of like a syndrome that we have within our community. What is the best path forward? And this question is for both of you. I'll start with you, Commissioner. But what is the best path forward to break through this loggerhead of anyone who differs from me is wrong?
Well, I think one thing that we must do internally ourselves is say, is there anything that I'm doing that provokes people that don't think like I do? And then I have a choice of whether or not I continue to do that particular thing or not. An example here, and you talk about protest, we had protests last summer, a peaceful protest, but there was a tank parked outside of the courthouse, and the sheriff, who, he was in charge, and he didn't view that as a big deal. He just put the tank out there. That was viewed by the protesters as a threat. And as you say, treating them in a way that was overdoing it, right? And so I called the sheriff and said, hey, I know you don't view it like this, but that is being viewed in a way that might create even more agitation. So would you please remove the tank? I'm not telling you to take it away, put it 2 blocks away so it's still near, but just don't have it next to the courthouse because it's inciting people to get even more angry. So we do have to think to ourselves, am I doing anything that leads to incivility? And if I am, can I check it? And then when others are doing something that's viewed like that, to take a reasonable approach. I mean, I didn't, accuse the sheriff of anything in particular other than pointing out that might not be the best idea. And he took the advice and moved the tank. So, there are ways to do this in a very tense and charged atmosphere if you can kind of keep your calm and make sure that, again, you're approaching people with respect, but being firm about what you're saying.
Well, I would just go right along with that. I agree completely with Denise. It's not just legislative leaders and other elected officials are, to a great deal, a reflection of the public that elected them. And studies show that the American people are becoming more polarized themselves, that we tend to hang out with people who think the way we do. We still search for news sources that agree with us and blogs or whatever it is. And we've created our own little echo chambers here so that we only hear what we believe. And we start to think, well, that everybody must think the way we do because everybody we're listening to believes the way we do. And then if somebody comes along that has a different point of view, well, it must be because they're uninformed, or they're insensitive, or they're dumb, or something like that. And sometimes we even villainize them. I think we as American people need to broaden our understanding of the policies and policy making and so forth as a whole. When I visit with groups, they say, what can we do to become more involved in politics? One thing I tell them is get informed. Don't just listen to one-sided news sources. Listen to CNN, listen to Fox News. You can have your favorites and so forth, but hear what other people are thinking and try to understand why they're thinking that. And so I think we as a people have all got to step up. And I have a good friend, and he calls me. We get together about every 3 or 4 months just to talk about the anxiety that he feels with the things that he's reading and things that he's hearing about our country, the demise of our country, and all the terrible things that are going on in politics and so forth. Half of the stuff is just half truths, and he has created so much anxiety within his own mind and in his own heart. And he says, how can I get past this? I said, well, first of all, you just go into some of those blogs that ask for a donation at the end and just unsubscribe and start listening to a more wide variety of news sources, and talk to a wider variety of people, talk to people with other points of view. It comes back to that engaging differences, which is what we try to promote. And until we understand that other reasonable and moral human beings can come to different conclusions than we do, we're going to continue to have this problem. But I think all of us as individuals and as citizens and good Americans, we need to work harder on that.
I couldn't agree more. That leads perfectly into my next question, which talks about, those that are in public office and that truly want to try to understand, as you mentioned, seek to understand is one of the things that the training encourages. But for those that are in public office, that answer to a broad base of constituency, right? I mean, I remember being as a legislator, 48,000 people, and I guarantee they didn't always see eye to eye on every little thing. So truly trying to take in the information and to listen and to learn, and in doing so, may find themselves in a situation where they actually change their mind or they change their point of view on any given policy. What would your advice to them be? What would you, when you are in a climate that discourages that calls compromise a dirty word, or that accuses you if you change your mind of being evil, or as you mentioned earlier, even maybe just dumb. But what would you say to them? And let's start with you, if you don't mind, Pro Tem, and then we'll go to you, Commissioner.
Okay. Well, I got from the question you're talking mostly about policymakers and those in public office, and how they do change their mind and not come across as waffling. When I talk to new senators that come in, we talk about this quite a bit. And one of the pieces of advice I give them is keep your powder dry. Always. Never commit until you're sure about how you're going to make your vote. In the 19 years that I spent there, and people have a hard time understanding this, but I only committed my vote, other than my own legislation, I only committed my vote on 2 other pieces of legislation before it went through the whole process. And both of those times, when it came down to the vote, I wished I had not made that commitment, because I felt differently when it came to that point. But I had to keep the commitment that I had made. But I learned my lesson really fast. And so, I think it's sad when you get a bill out there and you got so many co-sponsors on it that you don't even have to take a vote because you've got enough co-sponsors on the bill to pass the bill. For heaven's sakes, we need to have the public input. We need to have the public hearings. We need to have debate. And all of that is just a sham if we've already made up our minds how we're going to vote. So when somebody asks me, how I'm going to vote on a certain issue, particularly when the bill hasn't even been written yet. I have no problem with describing where I'm leaning and so forth, but I always tell them I always reserve the right to get smarter, and that comes through going through the process. And so, if you allow yourself that, and if your constituents will allow you that privilege of learning all there is to know, that's why they sent you there, to do your homework and learn everything there is to know about the issues. If they'll give you that courtesy, then you're going to go through the whole process, and then you're not making a commitment early on and finding out there's a better way to do things.
Oh, my turn. So, yeah, I was just thinking, when I became a county commissioner, I represent over 800,000 people. So they definitely do not always agree. And so when I first got elected, I felt it was incumbent upon me to go learn something from this very diverse group of people that I represented. And so there are 49 jurisdictions in the county. And so I did my 49 and 49. So I visited all of them. And I didn't discriminate between one or the other. I mean, everybody, I was trying to create relationships. Many of them, especially out in the townships, which are very conservative Republican areas, were like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, well, I've come to introduce myself, and I've come to start to create a dialogue with you about what's important to you. And I'm staying for the meeting, right? I'm going to sit in the seat and listen to what the issues are out in your townships or out in your villages. And they were curious about that, but they also came to understand that I was sincere and respected it. And we've created these dialogues now, especially during COVID. I'm on once a week with all 49 jurisdictions. We've created a relationship. I just asked them today, hey, we're looking to get out into the community to deliver shots. Do you guys have community centers, apartment buildings, mobile home park? Tell me where we should go. And they're responding to that because they trust the dialogue, and it's a true partnership. And so my advice, I think, would be do the work, right? And be open to, like Brent said, be open to changing your mind, be open to maybe thinking through something a little differently, or creating a relationship that surprises you. Be open to that, because really good policymakers are open to change.
There's a couple questions in the chat box that I'm going to kind of filter to get at. One of them is from those of us that live in Idaho, we all know, but one of them is from Trent Clark. He's a longtime political leader out of Eastern Idaho. His question is really, the gist of his question is, what do we do with those people who take extreme views on the right or the left to try to move the argument off of center in order to make a point? How do we navigate that as political leaders, and how do we make sure that when we are navigating those extreme views that are specifically designed to pull an argument one way or the other, that we remain in a civil environment, and how do we get it back to center? I'll start with you, Commissioner.
I think it's when the protests were happening here in Cincinnati, they were right outside my window. And so I went down and I joined them. I mean, I needed to understand what the problem, what their view of the problem was, what they were thinking. So I joined them, and I hung out with them, and I listened to them, and I approached some of the leaders of the protest and said, what is your idea of moving forward? What do you think needs to happen? And so it was interesting. We didn't always agree on everything, by the way, but it was level setting, because again, they're kind of surprised when you do that. But I was really curious. And so we started to create a bit of a dialogue there too. And I guess the idea is you can't be afraid to talk to people that you don't always agree with. I mean, we're all adults. We have to be open to those conversations and keep it civil. And if people, and they weren't always civil. Sometimes they were yelling or being disrespectful of myself or others, just call it and say, hey, I can't hear you anymore because of the manner in which you're approaching this. So let's, in order for me to hear you, you've got to calm it down and at least be respectful so that we can talk to one another.
There's another question here, and there's a couple. I'm going to get to both of them. I want to ask this one. I'm also going to paraphrase it. This question is from Tanner. It's more of a comment, but there's a question to it, and it's from Tanner Proctor. and he talks about biases in the media. But I want to broaden that conversation, and Senator Hill, I'll let you answer both questions since I forgot to come back to you. I'm a rookie. But he talks about biases in the media and how that's a major piece of the problem. But could you address biases in general? Humans are extraordinarily prone to biases and heuristics as a thinking tool to shortcut all kinds of factors, whether it be because they're overwhelmed in their life or whatever. But we are prone to shortcuts, biases, and heuristics. What are some tools that you use when teaching people to try to sidestep those biases, whether it be when they identify biases in the press or when they're actually utilizing biases in their decision-making processes?
Well, thanks, Matt. And that's a difficult question because it's always hard to relate and to communicate sometimes with somebody that has some heavy biases. But one of the principles of civility is that you got to find some common ground. And no matter how narrow that real estate is, we need to find that ground that we can agree on. And then you start building from there. If you go in with the attitude that you don't agree with anything that person stands for or what they believe or anything, that doesn't lead to a better civil discourse or any kind of discourse at all. And so it's like Denise said, trying to understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from that. Those ideas may not be as extreme as they seem at first when you realize the circumstances or the experiences that person has had, and realize that they are a fellow human being, that they have come to certain conclusions because of, again, certain experiences or events in their lives. And just taking the time to try to understand why they have those biases, why they have these extreme attitudes and so forth, can give you some insight. And you might actually learn some things that can affect your points of view, converted, or that you're going to agree completely. But there's always something we can learn from one another. And I don't know. I think we all have biases to some degree. Some of them become more extreme, and some people are more aggressive in expressing those and so forth. We got to get past our own personal biases and find that common ground. We all care about education. We all care about healthcare. We all care about the Constitution and freedom. We all want to, you and Idaho, you all want to make Idaho a better place to live and to do business and to raise our family. We have those common goals. We may have different ideas or biases on how to achieve those goals, but let's start on the things we can agree on.
Matt, if I can expound on that just a little bit, I couldn't agree more. I think that, even though we may have differences, we may, whether it's an ethnic difference, cultural difference, religious difference, whatever those might be, there's going to be differences amongst all of us. However, the things that are most important in life, we are the exact same. And that is that we all want to be accepted. We all want to be loved. We need food and air, and all of the most important things in our lives, whether that be the need for security and love and understanding, or whatever it might be, we are the same. The things that are most important in life, we are the same, even with our differences. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that the person sitting across from us is someone's brother or sister, someone's mother or father, someone's daughter or son, somebody's neighbor or friend. And we need to get back to remembering that when we have our conversations with individuals.
One last question for you, Commissioner, and then I think we're going to have to sign off here. But there's a comment from Clinton Johnson, and his comment really revolves around this idea of why should folks who feel like, and are in some cases, in many cases, having their civil rights or their human rights trampled on by those in power, why should they be expected to comport themselves civilly when in fact they're being abused or disabused by the system in a way that holds them back and limits their ability to accomplish their own personal desires, goals, and access to equity?
So I would maybe argue with the premise just a little bit and say that I think I'm a very practical person. So I think in order to get things done, you have to be heard. And I think sometimes if the tactics are tactics that interfere with being heard, I'm not sure they're the best tactics. I mean, Brent answered this earlier, that I've been challenged about the idea of civility, and that it to this question kind of keeps people back, or there's an inability to express themselves. I would like to turn that a minute and say, but if you're expressing yourself to someone that can no longer hear you because you're yelling or you're doing whatever, then that's counterproductive. And so there's a sweet spot in there where you are expressive. If you're feeling rage, you exhibit rage in a way, though, that when you're speaking to the person you're trying to convince of something, that rage is not at them necessarily, but rather it's conveyed to them a way that they can hear you speaking. That's, I think, kind of the challenge there. I absolutely agree that if people are frustrated and angry, that they should be allowed to express that. But when it gets down to doing the work and conveying those thoughts, I think that sometimes you have to change your tone a little bit depending on who you're talking to. And I want to riff just 1 second on what was just said about NextGen, and how one of the tenets of NextGen and one of the special things is that people that go through this training get to tell their personal stories and why they are who they are and why they think like they think. And so it's really interesting because, as has been said, we all want the same things. We're just getting to life in a little bit of a different journey. And so those moments are really powerful because it helps us understand why people are where they are on certain things. And so I think that's the power of some of the work that we've done with NextGen.
Kelly, do you have anything to add here? What a great conversation today.
It has been. Thank you so much, Denise and Brent, for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
I also want to point out that there were 2 comments in the comment stream. One about Braver Angels. For those of you that are not familiar with Braver Angels, they are doing an incredible amount of work around the country to try to depolarize and get people to reach common understanding. And the other one is the Civic Engagement Alliance is hosting a community conversation in Coeur d'Alene. So there is work being done around the state to try to really start to focus on what brings us together and what helps identify our entire communities in a civil and moderate way moving forward.
And we have partnerships with most of those organizations. We're working with them, and we're great. It's great to have them. They're doing good work.
The more the merrier is kind of how I think we've got to look at this. And so, Commissioner Driehaus, thank you so much for bringing your perspective from Ohio. Senator Hill, it is a pleasure to have you on again and to hear from you, and congratulations on the new moves, I guess I could say plural. But before we sign off, I just want to thank Dawson Taylor and Idaho Central Credit Union. Dawson Taylor Coffee Roasters and the Idaho Central Credit Union are just committed to ensuring that we're able to deliver these types of programs and this type of content. I also want to thank Power Engineers and EarthStat Architects and our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, and the Idaho Press. We'll be back in May with Congressman Mike Simpson, and our topic will be on salmon and dams, an extraordinarily controversial topic that has not invited civility so far. We're excited to have Congressman Simpson on to really talk about how he's planning to create a collaborative environment to move forward with some big initiatives. So with that, Kelly, thank you so much. Thanks to both of you, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks.